Picture this, a dusty Texas town in 1880, where whispered superstitions carry more weight than Christian charity, and where a young woman can be branded as cursed for tragedies beyond her control. In an era when communities were supposed to protect their own, what happens when fear and prejudice turn an entire town against one innocent soul? This is the extraordinary true-to-life story of Thomas McKenna, a solitary cowboy who lived by his own moral compass, and Isabella Martinez, a woman whose only crime was surviving when those she loved did not. In a time when conformity meant safety and standing alone meant danger, one man's act of defiance would challenge an entire community's beliefs about fate, faith, and what it truly means to be blessed or cursed. What you're about to witness is more than just a love story, it's a powerful testament to how courage and compassion can triumph over ignorance and fear. It's about finding light in the darkest moments and discovering that sometimes the very thing others call a curse can become your greatest blessing. In the scorching heat of a Texas summer, when the line between salvation and damnation seemed as clear as black and white, Thomas and Isabella would prove that love doesn't just conquer all, it transforms everything it touches, including the hearts of those who witness it. Are you ready to journey back to 1880, to a time when a single act of kindness could change not just two lives, but an entire community? Buckle up, because this story will take you on an emotional ride through the American frontier, where prejudice meets compassion, and where love ultimately prevails against all odds. If you're excited to discover how this incredible story unfolds, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing historical tales. Hit that like button if you're ready for an emotional journey, and drop a comment below telling us about a time when someone showed you unexpected kindness. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life. The merciless August sun of 1880 beat down on the dusty streets of Millbrook, Texas, creating shimmering waves of heat that distorted the horizon like a mirage. The air hung thick and oppressive, carrying the scent of dried earth, horse manure, and the faint aroma of freshly baked bread from the town's only bakery. Thomas McKenna adjusted his weathered leather hat, feeling the familiar weight of solitude settling on his broad shoulders like an old, comfortable coat that had molded to his frame over the years. At 32, Thomas had learned to find peace in his own company, preferring the honest silence of the open range to the whispered judgments and idle gossip of townsfolk. His face, weathered by years of sun and wind, bore the lines of a man who had seen his share of hardship, yet his steel-gray eyes held a depth of understanding that spoke of inner strength rather than bitterness. His chestnut mare, Rosita, picked her way carefully through the rutted main street, her hooves raising small clouds of dust with each step. The horse's coat gleamed with a healthy sheen despite the heat, testament to Thomas's meticulous care. He had raised Rosita from a foal, and she responded to his gentle touch with the loyalty of a trusted companion. "There goes the hermit cowboy," Mrs. Henderson muttered to her companion, Mrs. Patterson, as they stood in the shade of the general store's wooden awning. The two women clutched their parasols and shopping baskets, their voices carrying just loud enough for Thomas to hear. Strange man, that one. Living all alone out there on his ranch like some kind of wild animal. "My husband says he's not right in the head," Mrs. Patterson replied, her voice dripping with disapproval. "What kind of man chooses to live without proper company? It's not natural, I tell you." Thomas had grown accustomed to such remarks over the years. His decision to live alone on his small ranch 5 miles outside town, rarely socializing except for necessary business transactions, had earned him a reputation as an oddity among the close-knit community of Millbrook. The townspeople seemed to view his preference for solitude as a personal affront to their way of life. He guided Rosita toward the hitching post outside Murphy's saloon, the familiar creak of leather and jingle of his spurs creating a rhythmic accompaniment to his movement. The saloon's batwing doors swung lazily in the slight breeze, and Thomas could hear the low murmur of conversation and the occasional clink of glasses from within. As he dismounted and began to secure Rosita's reins, a sudden commotion erupted near the white-painted church at the end of the street. Angry voices rose above the usual afternoon calm, and Thomas could see a crowd gathering in the church's shadow. The sound of raised voices and heated arguments was unusual for the normally peaceful town, and curiosity got the better of him. Thomas approached the gathering slowly, his boots echoing against the wooden sidewalk. The crowd had formed a tight circle, their faces twisted with anger and fear. Men removed their hats and wiped sweat from their brows, while women clutched their children closer to their sides. The atmosphere was charged with tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. Pushing through the circle of agitated townspeople, Thomas finally saw what had caused such a stir. In the center of the crowd stood a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with lustrous dark hair that caught the sunlight despite its disheveled state. Her olive skin bore the dust and grime of travel, and her simple cotton dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing the desperate circumstances that had brought her to this moment. But it was her eyes that struck Thomas most powerfully, deep brown pools that reflected a mixture of defiance and desperation, like a cornered animal that refused to surrender despite overwhelming odds. There was intelligence in those eyes, and a strength that seemed to burn brighter in the face of adversity. "She's cursed, I tell you," Mayor Caldwell shouted, his round face red with indignation and perspiration. His gold watch chain caught the sunlight as he gesticulated wildly. First her mother died birthing her into this world, then her father perished in that terrible mining accident up in the hills, and now her brother Miguel's been trampled to death by spooked horses. Death follows her like a shadow wherever she goes. The crowd murmured in agreement, their fear palpable in the stifling afternoon heat. Thomas noticed how they kept their distance from the girl, as if misfortune were a contagious disease that could spread through proximity. Some made the sign of the cross, while others whispered prayers under their breath. "Please," the young woman pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the tension-filled air. "I have nowhere else to go. I just need. You need to leave Millbrook before you bring more tragedy upon our families." Sheriff Watson interrupted, his weathered hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. The badge pinned to his vest gleamed dully in the sunlight. "We've had enough death and misfortune for 1 year. We won't risk our children's lives for your sake." Thomas studied the girl's face intently, seeing past the accusations and mob mentality to the frightened young woman beneath. There was something in her expression that reminded him of a wounded deer he had once found on his ranch, proud but cornered, fighting for survival against impossible odds. The vulnerability he saw there stirred something deep within his chest. "What's her name?" Thomas asked quietly, his voice cutting through the angry voices like a blade through silk. The crowd turned to look at him, surprised by his intervention. Many seemed to have forgotten he was there, so focused were they on their collective fear and anger. "Isabella Martinez," Mayor Caldwell replied grudgingly, his tone suggesting that even speaking her name might bring bad luck. "And she's trouble, Thomas. Pure trouble. Best you stay away from her like the rest of us decent folk." Isabella's eyes met Thomas's across the crowd, and in that moment, something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared loneliness and understanding. Thomas had spent years being judged by others, dismissed as strange for his preference for solitude and independence. He saw the same isolation in her eyes, but hers was forced upon her by fear and superstition rather than choice. "Where will you go?" Thomas asked Isabella directly, his voice gentle but firm, ignoring the disapproving stares and whispered comments of the townspeople. She shook her head slowly, tears beginning to flow freely down her dust-streaked cheeks. "I don't know. I have nothing left in this world. No family, no money, nowhere to turn. I thought, I hoped someone might show Christian mercy." Her voice trailed off as she looked around at the hostile faces surrounding her. The crowd began to disperse, their point made clear. Isabella Martinez was not welcome in Millbrook, and they expected her to leave immediately, preferably before sunset. But Thomas remained, studying this young woman who had somehow become the scapegoat for a town's accumulated grief and fear. He saw the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances, the way she refused to beg or grovel despite her desperate situation. As the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the dusty street and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Thomas made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He approached Isabella slowly, his spurs jingling softly with each measured step. "I have a small ranch about 5 miles north of here," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to cut through the evening's growing chill. "It's not much, But there's a spare room and honest work if you're willing to earn your keep. Isabella stared at him in disbelief, her eyes wide with shock and hope. You would take me in? Even after what they said about me being cursed? Thomas tipped his hat slightly, a gesture of respect that seemed to surprise her. I've never put much stock in what folks say, Miss Martinez. In my experience, a person's actions speak louder than their reputation, and I'd rather judge you by your character than by the tragedies that have befallen your family. The ride to Thomas's ranch unfolded like a journey through a painting, the landscape gradually transforming from the harsh, dusty streets of Millbrook to the rolling hills and open meadows of the countryside. The steady rhythm of Rosita's hoofbeats created a hypnotic cadence that seemed to wash away the tension of the day's events. Isabella sat behind Thomas on the horse, her arms wrapped tentatively around his waist, still hardly believing that someone had shown her kindness after the town's brutal rejection. The evening air carried the sweet scent of prairie grass and wildflowers, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere she had left behind. As they rode, Thomas pointed out various landmarks: a twisted oak tree that had survived countless storms, a creek that ran clear and cold even in the driest months, and distant hills that changed color with the shifting light. That's where I often go to think, Thomas said, gesturing toward a small rise crowned with mesquite trees. The view from up there makes everything else seem small and manageable. Isabella found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks. There was something profoundly peaceful about the open country, away from the watchful eyes and whispered judgments of the townspeople. The vast expanse of sky above them seemed to offer unlimited possibilities, a sharp contrast to the suffocating walls of prejudice she had faced in town. As they crested a gentle hill, Thomas's ranch came into view, and Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The ranch house was modest but beautifully maintained, with a wraparound porch supported by hand-carved posts and flower boxes overflowing with colorful blooms. The structure seemed to grow naturally from the landscape, as if it had always belonged there. It's beautiful, Isabella whispered, and Thomas felt a warmth spread through his chest at her genuine appreciation. It's not much compared to the grand houses in town, he said modestly, but it's home. The property included a well-built barn, a small corral where several horses grazed peacefully, and a vegetable garden that spoke of careful tending. A windmill turned lazily in the evening breeze, its creaking adding to the ranch's peaceful symphony. Thomas helped Isabella down from the horse, his hands gentle but strong as they steadied her. He couldn't help but notice how she winced as her feet touched the ground, and his eyes immediately went to the torn fabric of her dress and the way she favored her right leg. "You're hurt," he observed, his voice filled with genuine concern rather than mere politeness. "It's nothing," Isabella replied quickly, instinctively trying to minimize her pain. She had learned over the years that admitting weakness often invited more trouble than sympathy. But Thomas had already noticed the slight tremor in her hands and the way she held herself as if every movement caused discomfort. "Come inside," he said gently, leading her up the porch steps. "We'll get you cleaned up and fed. Tomorrow we can talk about what comes next." The interior of the house revealed even more about Thomas's character than Isabella had expected. The rooms were surprisingly comfortable and well-appointed, with handmade furniture that showed both skill and patience in its construction. But what truly caught her attention were the oil paintings that adorned the walls, landscapes that captured the essence of the Texas countryside with remarkable sensitivity and skill. "You paint," she said, not quite a question but rather a statement of wonder. Thomas looked embarrassed, his weathered cheeks actually showing a hint of color. "Helps pass the time during the winter months when the work slows down. Nothing special really." But Isabella could see the skill in the brushstrokes, the way he captured not just the physical appearance of the landscape but its emotional essence, the loneliness of a solitary tree, the hope of a sunrise breaking over distant hills, the peaceful contentment of cattle grazing in tall grass. "They're beautiful," she said, moving closer to examine a painting of a thunderstorm approaching across the plains. "You see things differently than most people. You capture the soul of the land, not just its appearance." "Maybe that's why I don't fit in town," Thomas replied with a slight smile. "Most folks are too busy with their daily concerns to notice the beauty around them." Isabella nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She had always been sensitive to the natural world, finding solace in sunsets and comfort in the sound of wind through grass. It was another point of connection between them. "Let me show you to your room," Thomas said, leading her down a short hallway. The spare room was small but meticulously clean, with a window that looked out over the rolling hills toward a grove of cottonwood trees. The bed was covered with a quilt that appeared to be handmade, and a small washstand held a pitcher and basin decorated with painted flowers. Thomas brought her fresh water for washing and one of his clean shirts to wear while her dress was being mended. "I'll prepare something to eat," he said, pausing at the doorway. "Take your time getting settled. There's no rush." As Isabella washed the dust and tears from her face and hands, she caught her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, hollow-eyed, haunted by losses too numerous to count, aged beyond her 20 years by grief and hardship. She thought of her family, all gone now, and the accusations that had followed her like a persistent shadow. Her mother, Maria, had died bringing her into the world, a tragedy that had marked Isabella from birth. Her father, Carlos, had been a gentle man who worked in the silver mines, always returning home covered in dust but with a smile for his daughter. His death in the mine collapse had been sudden and violent, leaving Isabella and her brother Miguel to fend for themselves. Miguel had been her anchor, her protector, and her last link to family. His death under the hooves of spooked horses had been the final blow, leaving her completely alone in a world that seemed determined to blame her for every misfortune. When she emerged from the room, the aroma of beef stew and fresh bread filled the air, creating an atmosphere of warmth and welcome that she hadn't experienced in months. Thomas had set the table for two, and she noticed he had placed wildflowers in a small vase at the center, a thoughtful touch that spoke of his consideration for her comfort. "You didn't have to go to so much trouble," Isabella said, taking a seat across from him at the sturdy wooden table. "It's been a long time since I've cooked for anyone but myself," Thomas admitted, ladling the fragrant stew into bowls. "I'd forgotten how much nicer it is to share a meal with someone." They ate in comfortable silence at first, but gradually, Isabella found herself opening up about her recent losses. Thomas listened without judgment, his steady presence providing the first real comfort she had felt in months. He didn't interrupt or offer empty platitudes, but simply let her speak, occasionally nodding or asking a gentle question that showed he was truly listening. "They're not entirely wrong, you know," Isabella said quietly as they finished their meal, her voice barely above a whisper. "Bad things do seem to happen around me. My mother died having me, just like they said. My father's accident in the mine, my brother Miguel's death last month. Maybe there is something cursed about me." Thomas set down his fork and looked at her directly, his gray eyes serious but kind. "Do you believe that?" "I don't know what to believe anymore," Isabella whispered, tears threatening to fall again. "All I know is that everyone I love ends up dead, and now an entire town wants me gone. Maybe it would be better if I just disappeared." "Tragedy isn't a curse, Isabella," Thomas said firmly but gently. "It's just life being particularly cruel sometimes. I've seen plenty of families struck by multiple losses, and it's never because of a curse, it's because life can be hard and unfair, and sometimes terrible things happen to good people." Isabella looked up at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "How can you be so sure?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table. "Because I've lived through my own share of tragedy," he finally replied. "Lost my whole family in a house fire when I was 20. My parents, my 2 sisters, even our dog, all gone in one night. I spent years wondering if I was cursed, if I was meant to be alone forever. But eventually, I realized that sometimes bad things just happen, and we have to find a way to keep living anyway." For the first time since arriving, Isabella felt a flicker of hope. Here was someone who understood loss, who didn't fear her presence or blame her for circumstances beyond her control. Someone who had faced his own darkness and emerged stronger. "Why did you help me today?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. Thomas considered the question carefully, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Because I saw something in your eyes that I recognized. The look of someone who's been judged unfairly, who's been made to feel like an outcast for things they can't control. I suppose I couldn't stand to see someone else go through what I've experienced. He paused, then continued, and because I believe that sometimes we're put in each other's paths for a reason. Maybe it's not about curses or fate. Maybe it's just about human beings helping each other when the world gets too dark to bear alone. As night fell over the ranch, Isabella found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced in months: safety. For the first time since her brother's death, she wasn't alone with her grief and fear. Outside, the sounds of the night, crickets chirping, the distant call of an owl, the gentle lowing of cattle, created a peaceful symphony that seemed to promise better days ahead. 3 weeks had passed since Isabella's arrival at the ranch, and a comfortable routine had developed between them. She helped with the household chores and tended to Thomas's small vegetable garden, while he worked with the cattle and horses. Their conversations had grown deeper, moving beyond the surface politeness of strangers to something approaching genuine friendship. Isabella had proven herself to be intelligent and hardworking, with a natural talent for dealing with the animals. Thomas watched her one morning as she gently coaxed a stubborn mare to accept a bridle, her voice soft and soothing. "You have a gift with them," he commented, leaning against the fence post. "Animals don't judge," Isabella replied, stroking the mare's neck. "They don't care about curses or superstitions. They just respond to how you treat them." Thomas nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in her words. He had noticed how she seemed to bloom in the peaceful environment of the ranch, away from the suspicious stares and whispered comments of the townspeople. Their peaceful existence was interrupted that afternoon when Sheriff Watson arrived with Mayor Caldwell and 2 other men from town. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, his expression guarded. "Thomas," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "We need to talk." "About what?" Thomas replied, though he suspected he already knew. Mayor Caldwell stepped forward, his face stern. "About the girl. We know you've been harboring her, and we're here to tell you it's not safe. Bad things have been happening since she arrived." "What kind of bad things?" Thomas asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Old Mrs. Patterson's cow died suddenly," Sheriff Watson said. "And the Johnson boy broke his arm falling from a tree. People are saying it's because she's still in the area." Thomas felt his temper rising. A cow died and a boy had an accident? Those things happen every day with or without Isabella around. "It's not just that," Mayor Caldwell insisted. "The whole town is on edge. People are scared, and they have a right to be. We need her gone, Thomas. For everyone's safety." Isabella appeared in the doorway, having heard the conversation. Her presence seemed to make the men nervous, and Thomas noticed how they instinctively stepped back. "I'll leave," Isabella said quietly. "I don't want to cause trouble for Thomas." "No," Thomas said firmly, surprising everyone including himself. "You'll stay. This is my land, and I decide who's welcome here." The tension in the air was palpable. Mayor Caldwell's face reddened with anger. "You're making a mistake, Thomas. Don't let your isolation make you foolish. That girl brings nothing but misfortune." "The only misfortune I see is the fear and prejudice that's taken hold of people's hearts," Thomas replied. "Isabella has done nothing wrong, and I won't stand by and watch her be driven away because of superstition." Sheriff Watson tried a different approach. "Thomas, we've known each other for years. You're a reasonable man. Surely you can see the pattern of bad luck that follows her." "What I see is a young woman who's lost everything and needs help," Thomas said. "And I see a town that's chosen to blame her for tragedies she had no part in causing." The men exchanged glances, clearly frustrated by Thomas's stubbornness. Mayor Caldwell leaned forward, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "You're choosing to side with her over your own community, Thomas. That's not a decision you should make lightly. People won't forget this." "Then I suppose I'll have to live with that," Thomas replied, his voice steady and resolved. After the men left, Isabella turned to Thomas with tears in her eyes. "You shouldn't have done that. You've lived here your whole life, and now they'll turn against you because of me." Thomas took her hands gently. "Let them. I've never cared much for their opinions anyway. Besides, I've found something worth fighting for." Isabella looked up at him, seeing something new in his eyes, a warmth and determination that made her heart skip. "What's that?" "Someone who makes me want to be a better man," Thomas said softly. Someone who makes this old ranch feel like a home again. For the first time since her family's deaths, Isabella felt tears of joy rather than sorrow. In Thomas's steady presence, she had found not just sanctuary, but something she had thought was lost forever, the possibility of love and belonging. The confrontation with the townspeople had only strengthened the bond between Thomas and Isabella. As autumn painted the Texas landscape in shades of gold and amber, their relationship deepened beyond friendship into something neither had expected to find. Thomas had been hesitant to acknowledge his growing feelings, knowing that Isabella was still healing from her losses. But her gentle nature and quiet strength had gradually broken down the walls he had built around his heart during years of solitude. Isabella, for her part, had discovered that Thomas saw her not as a curse or a burden, but as a woman worthy of love and respect. His unwavering support had given her the courage to believe in herself again. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas finally spoke the words that had been growing in his heart for weeks. "Isabella, I know this might not be the right time, and I understand if you need more time to heal, but I have to tell you, I love you. You've brought light into my life in a way I never thought possible." Isabella turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I love you too, Thomas. You saved me from more than just the town's hatred. You saved me from losing faith in myself." They were married quietly 3 weeks later by a traveling preacher, with only the vast Texas sky as witness to their vows. The ceremony was simple but profound, marking not just the union of two people, but the triumph of love over fear and prejudice. The news of their marriage spread through Millbrook like wildfire, causing quite a stir. Some townspeople were scandalized that Thomas had married the cursed woman, while others began to question whether their fears had been justified at all. The test of their union came sooner than expected. A severe drought had been threatening the region for months, and many ranchers were struggling to keep their cattle alive. Thomas and Isabella worked tirelessly to save their small herd, sharing their limited water supplies with neighbors in need. It was during this crisis that something remarkable happened. Instead of bringing misfortune, Isabella's presence seemed to inspire hope and cooperation. She organized the ranchers' wives to pool their resources, creating a network of support that helped everyone weather the difficult times. When the rains finally came, ending the drought, it was Isabella who suggested they hold a community celebration. Despite some initial resistance, the event became a turning point in the town's perception of her. At the Harvest Festival, Isabella's quiet kindness and genuine care for others became evident to all. She helped serve food to families, played with children who had once been forbidden to speak to her, and offered comfort to those who had lost loved ones during the drought. Mayor Caldwell, who had been one of her harshest critics, found himself eating humble pie when Isabella saved his grandson from choking during the festival. As he watched her calmly handle the emergency, he realized that the woman he had branded as cursed was actually a blessing to their community. "I owe you an apology," he said to Isabella later that evening. "I let fear cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry for the way I treated you." "We all make mistakes when we're afraid," Isabella replied graciously. "What matters is that we learn from them." One by one, other townspeople began to approach Isabella with their own apologies. They had finally seen past their superstitions to the woman beneath, someone who had endured terrible losses with grace and dignity, who had chosen to respond to hatred with kindness. As winter approached, Thomas and Isabella's ranch had become a gathering place for the community. Their home, once a symbol of isolation, had transformed into a beacon of warmth and hospitality. On Christmas Eve, as they sat by their fireplace with several neighbor families who had come to share the holiday, Thomas marveled at how much their lives had changed. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if I hadn't offered you shelter that day?" he asked Isabella as they watched the children play. Isabella smiled, her hand resting on her slightly rounded belly where their first child was growing. "I think we both would have remained prisoners, you of your loneliness and me of other people's fears. But love has a way of setting us free, doesn't it?" Thomas looked around the room filled with laughter and warmth, then back at his wife's glowing face. The woman the town had called a curse had indeed become his greatest blessing, and in loving her he had found not just personal happiness, but a way to help heal an entire community's wounded heart. Outside, snow began to fall softly over the Texas plains, covering the land in a blanket of pure white. A fresh start for all of them. The end.